A great white shark, measuring over 4 meters long, washes up on a South African beach, but there are no net marks, no boat damage, and no signs of a struggle anywhere on its body. The only thing out of place is one precise opening along its torso where the liver used to be. It wasn't partially eaten or torn at by scavengers. It was just gone, almost as if someone reached inside and took exactly what they came for. Something out there is hunting the ocean's apex predator, and it is doing a better job than the shark has ever done. That missing liver turned out to be the one clue that finally broke this whole case wide open. The mystery began back in 2017 around Gansbaai, which is a small coastal town in South Africa's Western Cape that built its entire identity around great white sharks. Between the cage diving tourism, the research stations, and the tagging programs, these sharks were the backbone of the local economy. When multiple carcasses started washing ashore within just a few days of each other, the local community noticed the change immediately. Researchers were completely confused at first because the wounds did not match any of the usual suspects. There were no propeller strikes from boats, no injuries from fishing gear, and no signs of any known disease. What they kept finding instead was a specific and almost deliberate pattern where a large opening was made on the underside of the shark to remove the liver while leaving the rest of the body untouched. One of those early carcasses belonged to a female the research community had been tracking for years, a well-documented shark named Khaleesi. The team at the Dyer Island Conservation Trust knew her well, and her body showed the exact same signature as the others with the liver missing. In some of the other sharks found during that same period, the heart and testes were also gone, but hundreds of pounds of muscle and flesh were left behind to rot. In June of that same year, a 4.1-meter male turned up at Pearly Beach with the same wound and the same surgical extraction. There were no bite marks anywhere else on his body, which ruled out the idea that this was just opportunistic scavenging or some kind of random feeding frenzy. Whatever was doing this was not actually hungry for shark meat, but was specifically hunting for the liver. This detail is important because a great white's liver is nothing like a human liver. It can weigh up to a third of the shark's total body mass and is packed with a lipid-rich oil called squalene that is incredibly high in calories. For a predator that knew what it was doing, that liver was the ultimate prize. A shark researcher named Alison Towner started documenting the pattern systematically for the Dyer Island Conservation Trust. She realized she wasn't just looking at a list of random deaths, but was instead seeing a behavioral signature repeated across different sharks and locations. This was targeted removal by something that understood shark anatomy well enough to go straight for the most calorie-dense organ and ignore everything else. The great white population around Gansbaai did not just lose a few individuals. It started thinning out in a way that had never happened before. Sharks that had been recorded in the area for years. Animals the research teams recognized by their fin shapes and scars simply stopped showing up at the cage diving sites. They were not being caught, and they were not dying of illness. They were choosing to leave. This left researchers with one massive question. What kind of creature can surgically remove the liver from a 4-meter shark, leave the rest of the body alone, and do it consistently enough to scare an entire population out of their own territory? The answer to how this happened comes down to two specific orcas, and they actually have names. Port and Starboard first showed up in South African waters around 2015, and researchers knew immediately who they were because of a strange physical trait. Both whales had collapsed dorsal fins that flopped over to the side instead of standing tall, which made them incredibly easy to identify and track over the years. They didn't travel in a massive pod like you might expect, but instead operated as a duo, and they eventually developed a repeatable hunting method that most predators simply don't have. By 2022, scientists had enough data to map out exactly how these two were working. A researcher named Towner published findings that year describing coordinated attacks where port and starboard worked in what the paper literally called cahoots with other whales. This was a deliberate partnership where one animal would corral the shark while the other moved in for the kill. One orca would drive the shark toward the surface to kill its ability to swim away, and the other would dive underneath to apply pressure to the shark's body. The actual extraction is the part that takes a minute to wrap your head around. Orcas are so powerful that they can use water pressure to squeeze a shark's torso, which forces the internal organs to shift toward the front of the body. Because the liver is so large and oily, it gets pushed right toward the shark's mouth, allowing the orca to pull it out cleanly without having to tear the rest of the fish apart. People used to think these wounds looked surgical, and in a way they are, because this is a precise application of physics rather than a messy feeding frenzy. Everything we thought we knew changed again in 2023 when Towner documented a solo kill. Port was spotted taking down a great white shark entirely on his own in under 2 minutes, which is a terrifyingly short amount of time for a predator to subdue something that can fight back. Since Port finished the job that quickly without any help from starboard, it proved the technique had evolved from a team effort into individual mastery. This wasn't just a trick that required a partner anymore, but was a skill that Port had mastered completely. Later that same year, something happened at Pearly Beach that researchers had never seen on this kind of scale. 17 great white sharks washed up on the sand in a single day. But they weren't killed by the whales directly. They actually swam toward the shore and stranded themselves in what looked like a total panic response to port and starboard being in the area. The sharks weren't being hunted one by one that afternoon, but were fleeing the water entirely, and many of them died just trying to get away. This isn't just a predator looking for a meal, it's total territorial dominance, and the great whites clearly knew they were outmatched. The reason port and starboard are so different from other apex predators is that their edge isn't about physical strength. A full-grown great white is actually heavier and has more raw bite force, and the entire species is built from the ground up for ambush killing. Port and starboard aren't bigger or faster than their prey, but they have a strategy they've refined through years of repetition. Orcas are famous for passing down culture and hunting tips to each other, and what happened in South Africa looks like a local innovation. While Towner's research hasn't confirmed if other pods are doing this yet, the impact is already massive. The ocean around Gansby didn't just stay empty once the great whites fled the area. Bronze whaler sharks and 7-gill sharks started moving into those vacant spots because the big boss was gone, and even the local seal populations changed their behavior. The entire food web along that coastline had to rewrite itself because of the absence of one species, and you can trace that entire shift back to 2 whales with floppy fins and a very specific set of skills. The great white didn't lose because it was weak. It lost because it finally ran into something that could outthink it. Port and starboard didn't flip the food chain by being the strongest animals in the ocean. They did it by being smarter and more precise than anything the great white had ever dealt with in its entire evolutionary history. We still don't know if other orcapods are going to start copying this behavior, so that's a question that stays open for now. If you want more stories where the underdog comes out on top, make sure to subscribe and stick around because we have a lot more rankings left to flip.